You're listening to Agile Ideas, the podcast, hosted by Fatima Abuchi. For anyone listening out there not having a good day, please know there is help out there. Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Agile Ideas. I'm Fatima, CEO at Agile Management Office, Mental Health Ambassador, and your host. This podcast is made possible thanks to Agile Management Office. We help businesses in three key ways: improving organizational culture and delivery, supporting transformation and change agendas, and streamlining governance and process using 20 years of proven practice and my proprietary PMO way model. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking to you about Agile Governance. If you have not heard the term, it's probably because it is becoming more and more obvious that there is a gap around how to put the Agile into governance and not the governance into Agile. So in this episode, I'm going to be talking you through what Agile Governance even means and why does it matter. I'm looking forward to sharing more insights about the reason why I'm talking about it, why I'm spending more and more time these days talking about it, commenting about it on LinkedIn, writing articles, and so forth. But it is becoming something of somewhat importance. It is an obvious gap for a lot of people in terms of knowledge and also what's out there to support governance needs in an Agile environment. I'm going to talk to you about what's happening today across organizations and the differences between big A Agile governance and small A Agile governance. I'm going to talk to you about some of the complications and challenges. I'm also going to share a little bit more about what you should be asking or thinking in terms of your own organization or team. The overall objective is also to help provide you with some insight to help you move forward in your organization. So let's get straight into it. So putting the Agile into governance and not the governance into Agile. Ultimately, most organizations, and particularly those that I've seen or worked with in the last 6 years since running Agile Management Office, are putting governance into Agile. It's causing more rigidity, more governance bloat. It's causing layers, not to mention it's actually increasing silos and the division amongst team. It's the antithesis of actually bringing teams together, and it's actually causing a lot more of a disconnect. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about that. But first, let me just share a little bit of a story. A few years ago, I wanted to go to Europe, and it was going to be my first big trip. I intended to visit 6 countries for work and pleasure. Now, having a fear of flying, it was important for me to make sure that I planned well up front to minimize the risks associated with such a big trip. Now, thinking about that trip, I wanted to make sure that I did not only the right things, but I also wanted to do things right. Now, governance fundamentally is about doing the right things and doing things right. Doing the right things is about making sure that I knew the rules before I traveled, what visas, what passports. I wanted to make sure I learned about the culture, the customs of the countries that I was visiting, and I wanted to make sure that I had processed any information that I needed to ahead of time with those countries. Doing things right is about checking to ensure that my flight departure was on track. So I don't get to the airport and then realize I am 9 hours early. I want to make sure that I have the appropriate attire from my winter woolies and then bathers for summer sun in Dubai. I want to also make sure that I understand how far is the hotel from the airport, and making sure I check the safe before leaving the hotel so I don't do what some people I know have done and left their passports in there when departing the hotel. So you see, when you think about all of those things that I just outlined, fundamentally, it comes down to what I refer to as guardrails, customs rules and culture and the regulations, risk level, my experience or level, lack thereof. These are all important guardrails. So I personalized my holiday based on a range of factors and also the guardrails that were in existence to assist me in better managing my trip and better planning for it. If you think about travel, imagine doing the travel without some predefined guardrails to guide you. Imagine going to a country and having no understanding of their culture or values. Imagine not being aware of the rules around prohibited substances. When we think about those guardrails for a simple thing such as travel, why is it that we expect our teams around us in organizations we work with to understand the governance guardrails for our own departments? We make assumptions that they will and that they understand it, but we need to make sure that we don't assume that they do it. We need to make sure they understand it. So let's deep dive a little bit more into what Agile governance even means. Now, let me be clear. It's probably not what you think. It's also important for me to outline, because I've had this discussion and or debate with a few people. Agile governance can complement traditional governance. Governance is governance regardless of where it's being applied, right? So Agile governance can complement traditional governance. It's just a way to increase flexibility and responsiveness for stakeholders and customers. It is not a one way or the other. It is not a agile versus waterfall. It is not one is better than the other, and you can't. Ultimately, every organization that I have experience working with over the last many years has always got their own mixture of waterfall and agile. So it's not about agile versus waterfall. This is not what agile governance is about. But let me share a little bit more about what it actually is. Before we can do that, we need to also challenge what governance is before we can understand its place in agile. Again, there's a lot of assumptions that are made when talking about governance that everyone knows what it is. If you take a moment now to think about governance, what comes to mind for you as you're listening today? Ultimately, it probably will vary from one listener to another. Agility, in some instances, has developed into a dysfunction of misunderstanding around some basic operational guardrails. For example, when we think about oversight in a non-negotiable environment, such as the regulations that apply for shareholders, the regulation that applies in banks is of utmost importance to shareholders. And it's not like we can not have governance in those environments. Governance applies everywhere. It's just the way that we apply it. There is a lot of assumptions being made around what agile governance is, and the assumption that it's all about governing agile teams. The reason being is when agile is not done well, there is a lack of visibility on what is being worked on, the progress of the work, and how it ties back to an initiative. I'm going to talk through a few specific examples, but first of all, I want you to think about what's the most common excuse that I hear when it comes to agile. And you probably have heard this because this is one of the things that I hear all the time. And if you haven't heard it, I'd be very surprised. But ultimately, it goes like this. But we are agile. What governance? Now, governance will still apply whether it be coming from external regulations, enterprise policies, or project-specific requirements. A move to agile means we need to enhance the way we govern. We don't turn it off. We don't stop governing because we're in agile. As a partner to delivery, I often work with teams to ensure alignment across the value chain by removing roadblocks and providing that executive level visibility, but also streamlining repeatable process and improving the ability to move at speed. It's always reasonable to expect to have oversight and to understand the drivers of cost, of value, and timeframes around an initiative. It's amazing to me how many times these fundamentals can get squeezed out of areas that aren't well managed. It really, really is. So going back to the question of, but we are agile, what governance? Well, my response is usually, have you seen yourselves without governance? It's absolutely chaotic. So you need to travel smarter, not harder. You don't want to get stuck at the airport with security like me, getting stopped for every smear test imaginable. So why do we think we don't need governance? I'll tell you a secret. The ones shouting that they don't need governance are usually the ones who need it most, as they often lack the most accountability. We can self-regulate, but you don't. Though most teams can't even submit their timesheets on time each week. Seriously, they can't. Simple governance. Why do we have several single points of truth? The whole purpose of being a single point of truth is for it to be a single point. And then there's also the comments around governance will slow us down. No, your lack of maturity does. So it's time to rethink governance and how we put the agile into governance, not the governance into agile. But first, let me remind you, what is governance? Governance is under three key aspects. If you think of an umbrella, there's three key components underneath governance. There is structure. Structure is around accountability. It's around process. It's around flow of communications and escalation. People, which is around structure effectiveness, which is dependent on the people. It's around culture, staff retention, rules of engagement, and mindset. And then you've got the information, which is around methods and processes and policies. People often assume that governance is about rules and controls and methods and checklists, but it's so much more than that. Fundamentally, it's underpinned by those three key pillars: structure, people, and information. When we think about projects aren't static. Neither is our governance. I believe that good culture equals good governance, and good governance equals good culture. Good governance will set the foundation for good culture. It will provide your teams with an anchor point. The anchor point effectively is your roadmap so that everyone knows where you're going and everyone is on the same page and understands where you currently are. But it will also help to drive performance and employee engagement. Ultimately, we need to remember that we are balancing the needs of customers, employees, and in some cases, shareholders. But unfortunately, the people in projects is getting lost. When you think about how you choose to deliver projects, governance is concerned with a number of questions. And these are some of the questions I would recommend you be asking. Does the project align with current business needs? Does the project offer value to the business? Is the output clearly defined in terms of timing, cost, and scope? Can the project be monitored and measured transparently? Are the risks clearly called out and plans to manage them defined? And how will the project comply with any regulatory requirements? It's interesting to me that even in some of the most mature project delivery environments, companies that spend hundreds of millions of dollars on project management are struggling with adopting the concepts of agile governance. So what is agile governance? Well, I think there's kind of two types. To me, I'll just simplify it by saying big A agile governance is ultimately around ensuring alignment of an agile project/initiative within the organization's overall goals. It ensures it's clear how the project will or is creating value for the organization. Whereas small a agile governance, or we can refer to it as lean governance, is about the adaptive, human-centered, inclusive approach. And that governance itself is a multi-stakeholder effort. Why? Because being agile is about lean governance. Doing agile applies to agile, big A agile governance. So I like to split the two to differentiate between them, because at the beginning when I mentioned around putting the agile into governance, not the governance into agile, what I'm referring to is putting the principles behind small a agile into agile delivery teams. This is again back to the people. It's about the soft skills. It's about flexibility. It's about collaboration. It's about defining the way that we're going to work, thinking about the growth needed for the teams. It's thinking about all of the cultural aspects. It's thinking about trust and transparency, coordination and collaboration. All of these things form part of being agile. It's all about mindset more so than anything else. Whereas when we think about agile governance from a doing perspective in agile teams, of course, we need to understand what is the burn rate, for a project. Of course, we need to understand who's working on what and when. Have we met the predefined requirements of the customer? Or are we going to be understanding the customer's requirements as we go? It happens both ways, and organizations and teams themselves are doing various things despite having frameworks that exist around what Agile means to them. Ultimately, it needs to be defined for your specific organization. And no two organizations are alike when it comes to this. When we think about some of the challenges, one of the ones that is very, very obvious, and it was also something that was called out in, I think, the 15th State of Agile report, which is the longest survey on the state of Agile. But one of the main barriers is the top barrier of 46% of people that responded say it's inconsistent processes and practices across the teams. Now, that is from an Agile perspective and is, I would agree, is definitely the most prominent barrier or challenge that I'm seeing. And firsthand experience, as recent as only a few weeks ago, working within an organization that is quite mature in project delivery, but seeing the amount of waste because the team approach and practices are so inconsistent, it makes it really hard for people to move from one department to another. It makes it really hard to roll up that governance reporting that's needed for executive oversight. It makes it really hard to understand what was done before and what we can leverage from that, what lessons were there that we can leverage. It makes it really hard to understand how to rescue initiatives that may be in the point of failure. It makes it really hard to understand and see and manage the necessary oversight. Inconsistent processes and practice is one of the main issues. And the second one is also around organizational culture, where an organization's culture is at odds with Agile values, which no surprises ties into the resistance to change. A lot of the time, resistance to change I've seen firsthand is not for lack of trying, but it typically is because people are afraid. It's about learning something new. And there are some of us that have fixed mindsets, others have growth mindsets. And sometimes in organizations, people get really comfortable in the roles that they are performing. And so they are very resistant to change because they don't want to move out of their comfort zones. And that's fundamentally an obvious thing that happens regardless of the type of change. It's even more difficult when we think about purist project management that maybe have spent most of their career in traditional project management environments using traditional methods and frameworks like, PMBOK and Prince2 and others that are so used to doing all of that planning up front, and changing that behavior and the mindset needed to change the behavior is really challenging for some people. Others take it in their stride, but ultimately we have to be aware that there are challenges. And it's something we need to be conscious of. So what are some of the challenges I'm seeing from a sort of governance perspective? Well, there's a number of them. I'll share a few of them. There is confusion between waterfall and agile layers. So for example, some organizations I would say most organizations I've dealt with are still doing upfront planning and investment planning and creating their funding envelopes and defining the budgets for the different divisions and streams of work, teams of work rather. And then once it gets into the teams, it then goes into more of an agile delivery model where the planning is based on an agile framework that exists, whether it's SAFe or Scrum or Kanban or whatever it might be. So there's still confusion between the layers of waterfall and agile. Some organizations are still doing that upfront planning because they don't trust their teams with the financials, but also they need to still have that oversight and control. Another challenge is the co-design and adaptation. The co-design and adaptation relates to scaling and tailoring governance. For example, when we think about governance and compliance, it's normally satisfied by upfront analysis and agreement on outputs, but that conflicts with core agile principles. So what do we do about it? Well, we need to co-design governance with our internal SMEs so that we minimize any duplication of process and remove it completely. We need to make sure that once we design new processes that we implement it in a staggered approach so we don't rush the adoption of those changes. We also need to look at the adoption of principles and frameworks. There are many methodologies that exist in the market deemed under the Agile umbrella. And how organizations choose the methodology and then choose to scale with one team to another is really important to have that view around how we define and manage that change. And also what sort of policies and practices will apply for when we look at the governance side of those initiatives. Some organizations are adopting a subset of Agile principles where others are maintaining existing governance approaches. This is where I'm seeing organizations trying to put the governance into Agile. Lack of delivery experience. Unfortunately, there's a lot of training going on, but a lot of the time it's based on theory. The concepts and methods for teams that are being trained will not stick unless they are immersed in an Agile environment. Agile coaches who are playing a project management role will also need to have a lot more cut through in order for them to be able to drive change effectively. And then one of my favorite topics, the PMO, the project management officers. There's such a lack of focus on them. The community itself needs clarity around the role of the project management office in an Agile environment. The amount of customers that I have either spoken to or heard through conversations in other avenues that have removed project management officers several years ago, only to just now realize they've got absolutely no visibility of what is going on, that now they're starting to bring those back in. We need to make sure that we understand the role of the project management office in an Agile environment. And I'm really excited to be sharing more about that in my upcoming Agile in the PMO workshop, which is ready, and more information can be found on our website. We're going to deep dive and go through a really immersive experience to help project management officers think about Agile and Agile governance. So there's a lot of barriers that we are facing. And unfortunately, many times when you think governance, you think, you know, a lot of negative thinking comes in. People assume that governance is a problem. It's not. It's actually a solution. I personally am a big advocate of good governance. I have been talking about good governance for a really long time, and I believe that it's underpinned by good cultures. Good governance will mitigate risks. It will provide a sense of direction, and I promise you, it will bring teams together. If we think back to the example I gave around traveling, imagine there was no border security. Imagine the things that travelers would bring into your country. It's quite funny when I watch that sort of border security show and see some of the things people try to bring in. I just can't imagine not having that role there. So anyways, let's cover off a couple of examples in terms of how Agile is being applied, and just think about how it's being applied in your organization. When we think about Agile and its adoption and application within an organization, there are some organizations that are applying it typically top down across the whole company. Now, that doesn't mean they're doing a big bang approach all at once. I've seen these transformation initiatives take a couple of years. It's on average, it's probably 2 to 3 years to be completely transformed. And we saw that firsthand with in 2014 when Barclays Bank decided to move their organization to Agile. And they moved 15,000 people in 2 years to self-organizing teams. Then we think about a multi-department approach. So, for example, in some of our large banks, we've seen Agile proliferate across particular divisions. So, for example, they might have covered Australia's region, but maybe not the Asia-Pacific region. And this is where it may be applied in a few departments or divisions, but not necessarily across the whole organization. Still a little bit more of a top-down approach. In some organizations, it's being applied in a single department. So, for example, in a utilities organization, I see firsthand the DevOps function being developed, which is basically it is a partnership between software development and IT operations. And that was in a single department. But what we found within a few years of that is actually that Agile flavor started to proliferate in other departments within that organization. That's more of a bottom-up approach. And then finally, another example is where individual sort of champions of Agile, maybe I've seen this in the test and development team or in the engineering practice, where individuals in those areas have come from maybe a strong background with Agile experience, and they from the bottom up start to apply it in their own team or their ways of working, and then it proliferates from the bottom up. So there's a lot of different ways in how to do and how to apply Agile, but it varies from company to company. What I like to tell people is ultimately when you think about governance, it's your foundation. And then your processes are the glue. Sometimes in high maturity environments, the governance bloat is really high. Whereas if you have a low maturity environment, start lean to begin with and then add from there. As you improve in maturity, you may choose to remove stuff along the way, but ultimately you need to start lean and using a key focus on areas that are going to bring you the most value. It's like, if you think about it, if you start with training wheels on your bicycle, the training wheels are there to stop you from falling over. As you learn to govern properly, you can wear your training wheels to lean on them. But over time, as you create repeatable processes, you'll forget that they are there, but they will save you in a difficult situation. Though if you take off your training wheels too early, you may fall off, but ultimately you'll still get back up. There's no right or wrong, but there is a more effective way to move forward with Agile governance. Now that you have a greater sense about Agile in governance and the challenges and some of the models being applied, I just want to quickly touch on a few approaches that organizations can consider to bridge the gaps between delivery and governance in an Agile way. And I'm just briefly going to share a couple of examples, but I really do implore you to reach out to me about the Agile in the PMO workshop, because I think you'll get a lot of value in that. We will have that in person as well as an online version, and I'm keen to start locking in some dates. So there'll be some information on our website, but I'll tell you more about that in a moment. Now, when we think about some of the key things to be aware of, it's really important that when you are setting up a governance approach framework for your business, that you seek out requirements from all of the interdependent functions. For example, projects, regardless of how they're run, will have dependencies on human resources, finance, risk, audit, etc. So when you're defining your governance landscape, you want to make sure not only that you seek out the requirements from those functions early, but you also want to create a cadence for ongoing review. It's really important to ensure the links between strategy, delivery, and governance. You also want to understand what's not allowed early and transparently. So if you are introducing more Agile into your organization and you need to govern that better, start thinking about what are the things that are absolutely not allowed and the things that are allowed. Doing that and removing the gray areas is going to be extremely beneficial for you as you move forward in your change journey. Then thinking about the governance in relevancy to the level of risk. So there may be some processes that are not required because the level of risk associated with them is so minuscule that putting in a process around it is just not going to add any value. So don't add unnecessary governance bloat for the sake of it. Instead, provide awareness and then provide more governance in higher risk situations. And in areas that are much more mature, then enable them to provide their own self-governance within their teams, but only in the areas that are less risky. And also make sure that training is not just based on theory. And then also taking a leaf out of the Agile book, or think about how to iteratively release governance based on specific needs. So you need to still have a plan, but you also need to iterate as you release governance and use that information to map back to your customer journey. And that is really important so that we do not overwhelm people and then burden them with Agile governance overload. Remember, this is new and you don't want to have that resistance to change by trying to do too much upfront. Ultimately, when we think about it, good governance is about having the experience to inform future actions to mitigate risks. It's about understanding interdependencies. It's about working transparently, knowing the rules up front. It's about knowing your level of risk, and it's defining based on your customer needs, and then testing and learning along the way. So in order to set your team up for success, ask yourself, does your team know where they are going? Do you have an anchor? Are you aware of the rules? Do you know the processes? And does every member have an active passport? So let's cut through the crap so teams can get on with delivery. Now, if you're keen on getting involved with more around Agile governance, I am leading a one-day Agile in the PMO masterclass in May. To register your interest, just reach out to me on LinkedIn, or you can email me at contact@agilemanagementoffice is all one word.com. So that's contact, CONTACT at Agile Management Office, AGILEMAGEMENTOFFICE.com. Otherwise, just reach out to me on LinkedIn and I will share more about that. I look forward to helping you on your journey, and thanks so much for listening. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. Please share this with someone or rate it if you enjoyed it. Don't forget to follow us on social media, and to stay up to date with all things Agile ideas, go to our website, www.agilemanagementoffice.com. I hope you've been able to learn, feel, or be inspired today. Until next time, what's your Agile idea?